So, I'm going to begin with reading a pasuk. We're going to talk tonight a little bit about the end of the reign of Shelomo HaMelech, and what possibly went wrong. But we're going to, at least in the beginning, you're going to need to have a Sefer Melachim. A Tanakh is fine, handy, but, because we might flip back and forth. So I want to we'll start with Devarim, Yud Zayin, Pasuk Tet Zayin, and Yud Zayin, famous Psukim. Rak lo yarbelo susim, velo yashiv et ha'am Misrayim leman harbotzus, va'Adonai amar lachem lo tosifun lashub b'derech hazeh od, velo yarbelo nashim, velo yasur levavo b'chesef v'zahav lo yarbelo me'od. So there is this concept that the pasuk has of not returning to Misrayim laharbotzus. In other words, somehow the return of Misrayim is antithetical to Jewish values, and it somehow involves some, what we'll call, materialistic values. And the equation here somehow is Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is somehow singled out. Well, we know the history that we have with this concept of Mitzrayim, right? The Torah says, it talks about Mitzrayim, Lo ke'eretz Mitzrayim hi, right? What's the difference of Eretz Yisrael and Eretz Mitzrayim? So it's the rain. So Torah tells us that Eretz Yisrael has rain. And the Rashi more or less the same question. Well, you mean Mitzrayim doesn't need rain, Eretz Yisrael needs rain, and somehow that's a good thing about Eretz Yisrael? I mean, Mitzrayim has automatic irrigation of a Nile, and Eretz Yisrael doesn't, and that's good about Mitzrayim, about Eretz Yisrael, right? Rashi says, of course it's good. God irrigates it for you, right? But the Ramban, as we've quoted a few times, says that no, the essence of Eretz Yisrael, which is antithetical to the essence of life in Mitzrayim, is that Eretz Yisrael mandates that God is a necessity, not simply a luxury, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu and involvement in HaKadosh Baruch Hu and praying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Eretz Yisrael is an automatic necessity which you are reminded of every second you must do. In Eretz Mitzrayim, you can forget. The security of Mitzrayim is nice. And life in Mitzrayim is tempting. So much so, who was the first person tempted by Mitzrayim? Yosef. Before Yosef. Right, Lot. Right? Lot, all of a sudden, goes down to Mitzrayim. He comes, before he's that, he's following Abraham wherever he goes. He lives in Mitzrayim, leaves Mitzrayim. The first thing we hear, there's a fight. And then how do we know that it was Mitzrayim that tempted him? Because when he chooses, where does he choose? Kikari Yarden. Why? Because it's Kigan Hashem Ke'eretz Mitzrayim, the Torah tells us. So there's this issue about Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is different than Eretz Yisrael. As the Ramban said, Mitzrayim doesn't need rain, and that means it doesn't need, theoretically, or you might think, God. It's a life of security. It's a life of economic stability. It's a materialistic life. Basically, it's the ancient America. It's United States of America in its first time, right? So that's what it was. That's what Mitzrayim was. And it's the lure of Mitzrayim, okay? So we're told that's different. That life in Mitzrayim is antithetical to the life in Eretz Yisrael. So this is a little introduction to what we want to talk about tonight. We want to talk about Shlomo HaMelech and what we'll call the downfall, the end of Shlomo HaMelech's reign. And but I think these psukim, I want you to keep in mind what Misrayim represents, why maybe there's a special and unique isur not to go back to Misrayim l'man charbot sus. What is sus? Sus is something we only find, by the way, for the first time in Misrayim, right? Susim are really, we'll call them the luxury. Our forefathers didn't write Susim, right? They wrote Gimalim, they wrote Hamorim. They didn't write Susim. It was the Egyptians wrote Susim, right? Seems like Hashub, right? That's the, whatever you want to call it, right? So, we're not to go back to Mitzrayim, Leman Harbot Sus. We don't do that, right? And that's the command. That's the what Mitzrayim represents and what Israel represents. Okay, now what I'd like to do is I'd like to start, and we want to try and figure out what happened to Shlomo HaMelech, right? Shlomo HaMelech. You're hearing me, yeah? Okay. Shlomo HaMelech, right, is the builder of the Beit HaMikdash. So I think we're going to take a little bit of a comparison between Shlomo HaMelech around Perek Tet and Yud and some of the earlier Prakim. So we're going to be flipping back and forth, right? I'll start. If we take a look, Perek Tet, Psukim Yud to Yud Dalid. ויהי מקצה 20 שנה אשר בנה שלמה את שני הבתים, את בית השם ואת בית המלך. So, we're a while after the completion of the Beit HaMikdash. חירם המלך סור נישא את שלמה בעצי ארזים ובעצי ברושים וזהב לכל חפשו. Right? חירם מלך סור supplies arazim, broshim, and zahav. And what does Shlomo give back? Az yiten melech Shlomo lehiram 20 ir be'eretz HaGalil. He actually gives him cities. He gives him cities for wood and gold. And as we see, the cities don't do so well. ויצא חירם מלך סור לא תארים אשר נתן לשלמה ולא ישרו בעיניו. No. Okay, this is a bit, should shock us a bit. Shlomo HaMelech has nothing to pay for the wood and the gold other than real estate. And he gives parts of Eretz Israel and cities that Hiram doesn't like. I want you to go back to Perek He, Psukim Kavdalet to Kaf He. Right? As like I said, you're going to need a Tanakh for this one. Perek He, Psukim Kavdalet to Kaf He. And we'll find there a little bit of a contrast. So Hiram would give Atzei Arazim and Atzei Beroshim. And what would Shlomo give? Shlomo natan leHiram 20,000 kor hitim, makolet lebeto 20 kor shemen katit. Ko yiten leHiram shana b'shana. So here he doesn't have to give real estate. Here there's excess farm produce. Right? He gives him hitim and shemen. Something in Perek Tet happens where he can only give him cities. Why? What's the difference? Well, I think the difference is, if you read carefully, what did Shlomo get in Perek He? Atzei Arazim, Atzei Beroshim. What does he get in Perek Tet? Read again. Atzei Arazim, Atzei Beroshim, Zahav. Oh, there's something new, a new commodity. By the way, That's mentioned a few times in Prakim and Tet and Yud. Zahav. Right? If you go to Perek Yud, Pasuk Yud, but Titen lemelech Shlomo me'av esrim kikar zahav. Again zahav. Go to Pasuk Yud Dalid. Vahi mishkal asher zahav asher ba'ad Shlomo b'shana had 666 kikar zahav. What is zahav? Where is the zahav in Perek He? It's not mentioned once. Something changed. Life in Israel changed from the beginning of the reign of Shelomo till the end. The beginning of Shelomo, we have a working people. Right? Shelomo has a working class people, a farmer. They produce. The economy grows, and the economy is a producing economy. By Perek Tet, we don't see much produce. If Shlomo wants to get what he needs, and what he needs is really more what he wants, a lot of zahav too, in addition, he's got to give up real estate in Eretz Yisrael, cities, and they're not doing so well anyway. Look at Perek Tet, Pesukim Kaf to Kaf Bet, if we want to be more convinced that the people in Israel changed. Okay? Does somebody want to read them? Kaf, Perek Tet, Pasuk Kaf to Kaf Bet. Any volunteer? Go ahead. So who's working? Foreign workers. Who doesn't work? Who doesn't do that type of work? Read the next pasuk. Okay. Hey, Kaf Het Lamed. Someone else. Any other volunteers? Nobody? Don't worry. Top. You continue then. וישלחם.
וישלחם לבנונה 10,000 בחודש חליפות חודש יהיו בלבנון שניים חודש.
I'm sorry. Go back one pasuk. Read started כף זין.
ויעל המלך שלמה מס מכל ישראל ויהי המס 30,000 איש. וישלחם לבנונה 10,000 בחודש חליפות חודש יהיו בלבנון שניים חודשים בביתו ואדונירם על המס. ויהי לשלמה 70,000 נושא סבל ו80,000 חוצב בהר לבד בשרי הנסבים לשלמה אשר על המלאכה 3,300 הרודים מעם העושים המלאכה.
So if you weren't convinced that things changed in Israel, there's another proof. They don't work anymore. They need foreign workers. They have to bring in haddami, right? Outside workers. We don't do that work anymore. They worked. Right? Now, Perek Yud. Pasuk Yud Aleph Yud Bet. Hiram melech sur nisad Shlomo b'atzei arazim b'atzei broshim b'zahav. Right? L'kol hafso az yiten melech Shelomo l'Hiram 20 ir b'Galil. Vayetze Hiram yisod lot ra'arim. Right? He didn't like them. So that's what we saw. Now, there's a whole discussion, continuing off in Pasuk Yud Dalid, of work and agreements between Hiram and Shlomo. What was the matara of that work in Perek Yud? Merchant, economic escapades, merchandising, trade. What was the purpose in Pasuk in the early Prakim? Why do you work with Hiram? The deal was to build the Beit HaMikdash. So the goals are different. In other words, a working class turns to a merchant class. There seems to emerge an upper middle class in Yisrael. One that doesn't work and one that doesn't really produce much. And so there seems to be wealth, growth, security. That's what seems to be changing. Now we know that wealth, growth, and security is what? The downfall of any economy. All you have to do is go over medieval history and you'll find that when people get comfortable and refuse to do the work and import others to do the work for them, what happens? That's the end of that society, right? They become lazy, right? And they don't produce anything. They're not a producing nation. They become a consumer nation. The consumer nation, the world, the consumer of the world usually falls apart. Okay? And it's the producing nations that actually are successful. So all of a sudden, Shlomo's Yerushalayim has turned from a producing nation to a nation of consumers. They don't work anymore. They want gold. They want. And we'll pay what we have to do to get it. We'll even pay from our own real estate and land to get gold. Perek Yud, Pasuk Kaf Dalet to Kaf He. What's important? Well, Shlomo is a wise man. What does he use his wisdom for? So, Perek Yud, I'm going to start with Pasuk Yud Gimel. Kaf Gimel. ויגדל המלך שלמה מכל מלכי הארץ לעושר ולחוכמה. Oh, he's greater than all מלכי הארץ בעושר ובחוכמה. Not just בחוכמה. וכל הארץ מבקשים את שלמה לשמוע את חוכמתו אשר נתן אלוהים בליבו. God gave him wisdom. And what happens? What does he get for that wisdom? והמה מביאים איש מנחתו כלי כסף וכלי זהב, right? סלמות ונשק ופסמים, סוסים, פרדים, דבר שנה בשנה. Shlomo knows how to use his wisdom. But what did he, go back to Gimel Tet. What was the point that he asked for the wisdom? Why did God give that wisdom to him? What happened in the beginning? Go back to Perek Gimel Pasuk Tet. ונתת לעבדך לב שומע לשפוט את עמך להבין בין טוב לרע כי מי יוכל לשפוט את עמך הכבד הזה. It was supposed to be for judgment. Now it's for Osher. Perek Yud. Pasuk Kaf Het Kaf Tet. This is scary. All right. No volunteers? Come on, someone else. Anybody else to volunteer? I won't yell at you. Don't worry, even if you make a mistake. No one? Go ahead. Perek Yod Pasuk Haftet. I'm sorry, my fault. Kaf Het and Kaftet. ממצרים. מוצא הסוסים אשר לשלמה ממצרים. ומקווה סוחרי המלך ככה מקווה במחיר. Wow. Now this is scary. Let's go back. What did the first pasuk I read to you? The first pasuk. רק לא ירבה לו סוסים ולא ישיב את עם מצרים למען הרבות סוס. We haven't talked about yet the Nashim Nochriyot. I didn't deal with that. Because to me, that's the second point. Perek Yud Aleph is when we start to criticize Shlomo. That's when the Navi starts to openly criticize Shlomo. I didn't get there yet. I'm starting the beginning here. I believe that Prakim Tet and Yud are important to set up the structure with these objective psukim where they're not used to criticize openly. None of these psukim I gave came to criticize Shlomo. I believe Prakim Tet and Yod are a foreshadowing of what's about to happen. I believe Prakim Tet and Yod have talked to us about a shift that happened in Malchut Shlomo. And those Prakim are crucial, and the comparisons to the earlier Prakim are very important to begin to understand how something changed, how it happened, how the downfall began. And the downfall came from luxury, luxurious lifestyles. that comes from security. Now there's a curious beginning of Perek Tet. God appears to Shlomo. And it's very clear. Vayera Hashem el Shelomo shenit. Right? This is a different dream than he had before. We all remember that first dream, right? It was really great. This is the second dream. And God tells him, Shamati et tfilatecha v'tchinatecha asher ethananta lefanai hekdashti et habayit hazeh asher banita subshemi ad olam v'hayu einai v'libi sham kol hayamim. You built it. It's great. I heard you. Ken? Atayim telech lefanai kasher alach David avicha betom levav ubiyoshel la'asot kol shetziviticha chukai u'mishpatai tishmor. Then hakimot et kitzei mamlecha Yisrael le'olam kasher dibarti al David avicha lemor lo yikaret lecha ish ma'kisei Yisrael. But im shov teshuvu natem u'bnechem mecharai v'lo tishmenu mitzotai hukotai asher natati v'nehem v'alachtem v'avatem elohim acherim mishtachavit alehem. There's warnings here. This is ominous. וכרתי את ישראל מהפני האדמה אשר נתתי להם את הבית אשר הקדשתי לשמי אשלח מעל פניי והיה ישראל למשל ושנאה בכל העמים והבית הזה יהיה עליון כל עובר עליו שום ושרח ואמרו על מעשה אדוני כך על הארץ הזאת לבית הזה ואמרו על אשר עזבו את אדוני אלוהים אשר הוציא את אבותם מארץ מצרים ויחזקו באלוהים אחרים וישתחוו להם ויעבדו על כן הביא אדוני להם את כל הרעה הזאת. What did God see? What happened? What's this ominous warning? That introduces the next pasuk, is gold. The next chapter is the trading of cities of Israel for gold. So, there's a change. There's a change in Am Yisrael. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is witnessing it. And it's a concerning change. Right. Gemara on Shabbat talks about this episode. Ma'arim asher natata li ahi ויקרא להם ארץ כבול עד היום הזה. מה ארץ כבול? אמרנו שהיו בני אדם שמחובלים בכסף ובזהב. They were filled with gold. People went after gold. So the Gemara on Shabbat already senses that something changed in Am Yisrael. People went after gold. Their values changed. How did all that happen? What happened here? And we're going to see even more that went wrong. And what we're going to try and figure out is, okay, now we've seen already, before we even entered into Perek Yud Aleph, how things potentially started to go wrong. What I want you to continuously keep in your mind is, how did that happen? In other words, okay, I'm trying to make sense of the next Perek, where all of a sudden it's an explosion. Nashim Nochriyot, Avodah Zarah. Well, this is Shlomo Melech. So I've already laid the groundwork to make that, to ease into that. Make it more, should be, make more sense. Right? A little bit more. Now we understand how Avodah Zarah, Nochriyot, which we'll talk about. But how did the money pursuits, how did the materialism seep in? How did that happen? So I'm really replacing one question with another. I just want you to keep in mind one Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Bet. This is a very famous Gemara that everybody quotes very often when we talk about Shelomo. רבי יהודה רמי כתיב, ויהי לשלמה 40,000 ערבות סוסים, למרכבתו כתיב, וישלמה 4,000 סוסים, הכיצד? Yeah. We'll come back to this Gemara because the context of this Gemara is important. I just want to quote one line from it. We're going to come back to it. Amar Shlomo, ani arbe velo asur. I will be marbe velo asur. The Torah says, lo yarbe lo nushim velo yasur levavo. Don't be marbe nashim because it might be sar levavo. Ani arbe velo asur. I will put myself in a test and I will not succumb to the Yetzer Hara. And of course, what happens? He's tested and he succumbs. Very similar to the Midrash we scored with David, right? It's very similar, interesting that the Midrash, right, that David says, test me, and then he fails. But with David, it's a one-time event. There's nothing, because of David's sin, it's a personal sin, right? And that's unique about David. As serious as the sin is, it's personal. It doesn't change his melucha. It may have effects in a personal sense, and it may also reverberate to how he is as a melech, but it doesn't change the policy of Am Yisrael. Right? Shlomo's very different. We're going to see the larger context of that statement. And we'll come back to that and where it comes from. Because there's some interesting points. So where does this all come from? Okay, we go now to Perek Yud Aleph, the difficult Perek, where it all seems to unravel. Right? And by the way, there are much more in Perek Yud, much more references to Zahav, which I didn't even, you'll read the Perek. I read a few of them. He made a kiss, like he makes a gold-plated chair. There's a lot of gold and wealth and opulence described all over Perek Yud, missing totally from Prakim Gimel, Dalet, and He. Missing. Okay. But we go now to Perek Yud Aleph. This starts the rough one. So first thing we're told about him is that he's Ohev Nashim Nochriyot. Right? And watch this. Shelomo Ahav Nashim Nochriyot Rabot Ve'et Bat Paro. Maviyot, Amoniyot, Adomit, Sedonit, Hatit. Just keep in mind that Bat Paro is singled out. Min hagoyim asher amar Hashem b'nei Yisrael lo tavo b'hem v'hem lo yavo b'chem achen yatu et levavchem acharei Elohechem b'hem davak Shlomo labal. Specifically the one you're not supposed to marry. And of course he had 700 wives and 300 prilakshim and vayatu nashav et libo. Vayhile et zikna, and here it gets really scary. Nashav itu et levo acharei Elohim ahirim. Acharei Elohim ahirim. I'll read the pshat. We can't even imagine that this is true, but let's read the pshat for a minute. Gemara, and then we'll see the Gemara and even the Pashtanim. V'lo haya levavo shalem im Adonai Elohav kilvav David aviv. Wasn't shalem with God. וילך שלמה אחרי אשתורת אלוהי צידונים ואחרי מקום שיקוץ עמונים והיה שלמה הרע בעיני השם ולא מירא אחרי השם כדוד אביו. Now that's a very scary pasuk. והיה שלמה הרע בעיני השם. That's about the bad מלכים. Certainly not what we think about שלמה המלך. עבודה זרה. אז יבנה שלמה במה לכמו שיקוץ מואב בהר אשר על פני ירושלים ולמולך שיקוץ בני עמון. מה זה? Now, Gemara and Shabbat, right? Shlomo lo hata. It's a list of all the other lo hata, but here the proof is lo hata was because he wasn't like Hare David Aviv lo alach, but he wasn't a hote. So that it's true that Gemara follows with the same concept of many of the biblical personalities that we say lo hata, but here it's really difficult to assume the peshat here. I mean, are we going to assume that Shelomo was an idol worshiper and he was very difficult? So, the Ralbag. Right? He wouldn't have had to say, the Ralbag is really quoting the Gemara. It doesn't make sense. It would say, like it said, says that Ralbag, he let the wives do it. It was all the women that got to him. Now, not to make him an Oved Avodah Zarah, but to tolerate Avodah Zarah in the nation. That's bad enough. You go to Yerushalayim, you don't expect these idol worship houses. But he let his wives build them. Not, God forbid, that he was an Oved Avodah Zarah. Right? He loved these women, and he let them do it. And that seems to be, by the way, the majority approach even amongst Pashtanim, right? Not just at Ralbag, but as well. Ralbag says. Right. Okay. So that seems to be that it was his tolerance for the wives. Now, so we got to go back to the wives. So the wives, Gemara Yerushalmi brings three opinions. What does it mean he loved foreign women? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, yes, he loved them. He had a passion for women. Rabbi Hanina says, no, he married them. What does that mean, he married them? He married them? What's the difference between Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and Rabbi Hanina? And Rabbi Yosef said he wanted to bring them close to Torah, but he failed. So let's take a look. Well, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he loved them. Rabbi Hanina, he married them. What does that mean, he married them?
Relation with the other nations.
For sure. Right? That's just, according to Rabbi Hanina, I believe that it was a foreign policy move. And according to Rabbi Yosef, it was an attempt at cultural adaptation, to spread his beliefs throughout the world. So we have potential based loving them. We have an expansive foreign policy, security, and we have a cultural exchange. All three might be true. They're indicative of different aspects of what may have caused Shlomo to marry many women. Now that's important, because what might have caused Shlomo to marry many women is what caused Shlomo to tolerate Avodah Zarah. So now let's make a connection. We have a new material culture. We have a strong culture. But still, in Prakim, Tet, and Yud, still firmly entrenched in Jewish monotheistic faith. But it's just material. The good life. They started enjoying the good life. Then we have Nashim Nachriyot. The Nashim Nachriyot represent either a continuation of that good life, which means foreign policy exchanges, and maybe, look, we, Jews, succeeded. Through our example of powerful economic stability, we can culturally interchange with the world around us now. We can have cultural exchanges. We can benefit from the world and they'll benefit from us. Look what we could give to them. Ever think sometimes when some people say, maybe we shouldn't be in such and such of a place? And the answer is, why not? You'll be a good example for them. Of course you should go out there. Why? Because don't worry about being influenced. What about you influencing others? Right? You're worried about being influenced? You exclude yourself? The opposite. You might influence them. Right? Sounds familiar a little bit. So that's a Shelomo thing here. So we have all of these things operating in Shlomo HaMelech's motivation, right? Basic on the part of it, basic loving women. That's always a rough one. Economic stability based on a material change that we saw beforehand. And of course, kiruv rehakim, which usually means rehok kirovim. Okay? Now, there's an important piece here. And there's somebody we have to talk about. Because this person is singled out. And this will be full circle to how I started. So, we're told very early on that Shlomo HaMelech, in Perek Gimel, Pasuk Aleph, ויתחתן שלמה את פרעה מלך מצרים, ויקח את בת פרעה, ויביאה אל עיר דוד עד כלותו לבנות ביתו ואת בית השם את חומת ירושלים סביב. Right? He marries Bat Paro. And he's a good guy. רק העם מזבחי במות, כי לא נבנה בית לשם השם עד הימים ההם. They're still in the במות, no בית. ויאהב שלמה את השם. He loves God. ללכת בחוקות דוד אביו. That sounds different. We just read. By the time he's אהב נשים נוכריות רבות ואת בת פרעה. And he's not going in the way of David Aviv. But here, he marries Bat Paro, and he's clearly, in this beginning of this marriage, he loves God. And he's following David's path. Marries her, he's in a good point. Here, she's mentioned again, he's not in a good place. So, Bat Paro has to be a crucial piece here. Right? And let's keep in the back of everything we just heard about Misrayim from the very beginning, right? Let's keep that in the back of our mind. We have Bat Paro, he marries her, he loves Borei Olam, and he follows David. Okay? All of a sudden, he's Ohev Nashim Nachrot, she's singled out, they're Mateh his live, and he's no longer V'lo mileh harei Hashem ke David Aviv. We don't certainly say about him loving Hashem. So, interesting. All right, I want you to go down to Perek Zayin. We'll talk a little, and there's something interesting about this Bat Paro. Bat Paro lives in an interesting place. He builds her a nice house, of course. He's got to build his wife a house. Otherwise, the wife gets angry. She wants a house, right? And פרק ז' פסוק ח' וביתו אשר יושב שם חצר החל מבית לעולם כמעשה הזה היה ובית יעשה לבת פרעה. He built her a house, בת פרעה. אשר לקח שלמה כעולם הזה. Built her a nice house. Okay. Where was this house? Nothing wrong with building a house for your wife. And where was this house? Go to Perek Tet, Pasuk Kaf Dalid. I know I'm making you turn a lot today, but אך בת פרעה עלתה מעיר דוד אל ביתה אשר בנה לה, אז בנה את המילו. Her house was in Hamilo. Very nice. We know the house was. So, we have a marriage to Bat Paro, and she lives in Milo. Now, we'll talk about it. We'll see in a second. We'll see. It's not just me saying it. We'll see. Now, let's talk now. What was the point of marrying Bat Paro? We love Bat Paro, but if you go to Perek Tet, Pasuk Tet Zayin, Paro melech Mitzrayim עלה וילכוד את גזר, וישרפה באש, ותקנני היושב בעיר הרג, ויתנה שילוחים לביתו אשת שלמה. Shlomo got some cities for this. Nice. Works. Paro captured it. He gets some cities. So, how convenient. Right? You marry Shlomo's daughter, and you get some stuff for it. All right. Bat Paro appears in the Midrash in a few places. Midrash Rabba. I'm going to start with Vayikra Rabba, and I'll go to B'midbar Rabba. Amar Rabbi Yudan, Kol otan sheva shanim shebana Shlomo bet hamikdash lo shata behem yain. Never drank wine. Kevan shebena'o, v'nasa bitya bat Paro. Now he marries bat Paro. Oto alayla shata yain. She induces him to drink wine. V'ayu shem shtei beluz ma'ot. Achat simcha lebinyan bet hamikdash, v'achat simcha lebat Paro. They get married the same night. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, shel mi akabel? Shel elu or shel elu? Which one should I accept? This one or that one? Be'ota sha'ala al da'ato lahariv et Yerushalayim. He had in mind to destroy Yerushalayim. From the very beginning, the first day of the building of the Beit HaMikdash, God wants to destroy it already. Ha'aduktiv kelapiv al hamati hayta li ha'ir hazot. Yirmiyah says, I was forced to accept this city. Amar Rabbi Hanya, 80 minei rikudim rakda bat Paro be'oto halayla. 80 dances. V'haya Shlomo yashen 4 sha'ot bayom. First time he overslept. U'maftechot shel bet hamikdash netunot tachat rosho. They couldn't. Hadutin al tamid shel shachar shekarev b4 sha'ot. That's why tamid shel shachar is karev 4 sha'ot. Going to be that day because Shlomo overslept. By the way, there's a Midrash, which we'll get to. Who was the one that woke him up? Who was the one that really got upset that Shlomo overslept that night? Yeravam ben Nevat. We'll go back there. So Shlomo oversleeps because of Bat Paro. Gemara says in Shabbat, not only did God think of building the Beit HaMikdash, destroying the Beit HaMikdash, but on that very day, he put a reed in the yam, and that became the foundation of Rome. So something happened that night with Bat Paro. Another Midrash, this one in B'midbar Rabba. Amar Rabbi Shmuel be'oto halayla shishim Shlomo melechet Beit HaMikdash nasa b'tyat Bat Paro. Same night again. והיה שם סהלת שמחת בית המקדש ולת בת פרעה. ועלתה סהלת שמחת בת פרעה יותר מסהלת בית המקדש. Meaning בת פרעה overpowered the בית המקדש. I don't know if this happened the same night. What the Midrash is telling us is there were two contradictory aspects to Shlomo HaMelech. There's Bat Paro, there's the Beit HaMikdash. And Simchat Bat Paro was more powerful to him than Simchat Beit HaMikdash. Hu da'amar matla kolo מחנפים למלכה. ולמה נקרא שמו למואל שהשליך עול מלכות שמיים ועליו. ובאותה שעה במחשבה לפני הקדוש ברוך הוא להחריב את ירושלים. רבנן אמרי, another story, 1,000 מיני זמר הכניסה לו בת פרעה, 1,000 songs she brought in. והיה מצווה לזמר לפניו באותו הלילה, והייתה אומרת, כך מזמרים לעבודת כוכבים פלונית, וכך מזמרים לעבודת כוכבים פלונית. Each song was unique to a specific עבודה זרה. מה עשתה בת פרעה? כי מין פרש שטחה לו למעלה ממנו וקבע כל מיני אבנים טובות ומרגליות שהיו מבריקות כאין כוכבים ומזלות. כל זמן שהיה שלמה רוצה לעמוד, היה רואה אותן כוכבים ומזלות וישן לו עד 4 שעות. She mesmerized him with what? Wealth, jewels. She knew her husband. So we have here the essence here of Bat Paro. Bat Paro represents something gone wrong. Bat Paro represents a little bit, at least certainly in the Midrash, and I would say even hinted well into the Peshat, that Bat Paro is something, a metaphor, certainly a metaphor of all the 1,000 women. 1,000 minei avodah zarah, 1,000 women. It might be the essence of Misrayim, which personifies what, as we said in the beginning? The desire for material security, right? The desire for stability. I don't need rain. I don't need rain. I got the Nile. We're fine. We're good. Shlomo HaMelech marries Bat Paro for security. Gets security, or so he thinks, because in comes the Onish. And the punishment is very quick. God gets angry. And what happens? The punishment comes in 3 forms. Hadad from Edom, the son from Aram Sova, and of course Yeravam. Where at least 2 of the 3 Sitanim that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Ma'amid. Right? Hadad. Vayakom Hashem Satan Lishlomo Hadad Hadomi Mizer HaMelech Hu Be'edom. Right? David kills all of them. This Hadad escapes. And he grows up. And because of the sins, now this is very important to understand, it's clear that this Hadad and all of the problems only come from Shlomo HaMelech's sins. It's not natural foreign policy problems. And Hadad escapes with his life and goes where? Where does he grow up? Who takes care of Hadad? Who watches him so he can be a Satan to Shlomo? Who's the biggest problem for Shlomo HaMelech? Dad. His father-in-law. Vayavo Mitzrayim el Paro melech Mitzrayim. Vayiten lo bayit velechem. Amar lo. Ve'eretz natan lo. Vayimsa Hadad hen b'nei Paro. Vayiten lo isha. Et ahot ishto. Wow. His kids. And he grows up there. והדד שמע במצרים כי שחט דוד אבותיו וכי מת יואב שר צבא ויום הדד שלחני ואלך אל ארצי. He says, what מה אתה חסר עמי? So, who brings up Hadad? Mitzrayim. The next Satan is Rezon ben Yada shel Barach meit Hadad melech Sova, and of course he's a Satan Yisrael kol yemei Shlomo. Now, of course, the biggest one is Pasuk Kavav. V'yiravam ben Nevat Efrati min Atzereda v'shem imot tzruah eshet isha almana eved l'Shlomo v'yarem yad b'melech. We'll talk a little bit about Yiravam, but I just want to now, he's the next one, but let's just go to Mim to see where Yiravam survives. Perek Yudat Pasuk Mim, v'yivakesh Shlomo la'amit et Yiravam v'yakom Yiravam v'yivrach Mitzrayim el Shishach melech Mitzrayim. So all of the problems, all of the problematic people, certainly Yeravam ben Nevat's the strongest problem we're going to know. All of these problematic people are brought up where, grow up where, in the very place Shelomo thought he'd get stability from. The very place that he married into, the very place that it was his major ally. That's who brings up his biggest enemies. By the way, we're stepping out of our comfort zone. If you think that there's just coincidence and that the evil isn't really coming from Mitzrayim, Perek Yud Daled, Shlomo's not dead a long time, and Perek Yud Daled, Pasuk Kavhe, Vahi b'shana hamishit lemelech Rehavam. That's 5 years after Shlomo dies. Allah Shishak Melech Mitzrayim al Yerushalayim goes and he attacks Yerushalayim. ויקח את אוצרות בית השם ואת אוצרות בית המלך ואת הכל לקח ויקח את כל מגידי הזהב אשר עשה שלמה. All the gold. Right? The gold goes back to Misrayim. So we have gold and Misrayim. ויעש המלך רחבעם תחתם what? No more gold. מגיני נחושת. Gold doesn't last long, by the way. Neither does a treaty with Mitzrayim. Both of the things have in common. They're not something we can rely on. Let's talk about Yeravam ben Nevat for a minute. We'll come back to this point. Yeravam ben Nevat, I want to go back to the initial introduction of Yeravam ben Nevat. Yeravam ben Nevat's an interesting guy because it's very funny. What's with him? Who is this Yeravam ben Nevat? We need to figure him out because he's going to be an important person in the history of Israel. Yeravam ben Nevat Efrati min Tzreda, Shem imo Tzru'a, Isha almana, Evet Shlomo. Right? Vayarem yad b'melech. He seems to rebel. V'zeh devar asher herim yad b'melech. Now, we're going back. This is how it happened that he rebelled. Shlomo bana et yad b'melech. Shlomo bana et hamilo. Something was building the milo. Sagar et peretzir David Aviv. And because he was boneh the milo, he had to be soger, an opening of Ir David. Let's keep this milo in mind. Va'ish Yeravam gibor hayil. Vayash Shlomo tanar ki yosem melachim vayafked oto lechol sevet Bet Yosef. And he's in charge of some form of work in Bet Yosef. So this is a problematic order of psukim. You didn't tell me how he rebelled. You said you're going to tell me how he rebelled. So basically, to reconstruct it, according to many of the mefarshim, what basically happens is there is some form of tax for whatever purpose. We'll talk about that in a minute. And overwhelming the people with this burden. And he was somewhat an important person, and he was in charge. And, and by some form of maybe some unfair tax for excessive building purposes, he decides this is not fair. And he becomes somewhat a man of the people, and he rebels about what he considers maybe some unjust practices of Shlomo. Now, let's keep Milo in mind. The Gemara in Sanhedrin actually, I'd like to go back to this Gemara in Sanhedrin because we have a contradiction. Here, right? Was there Zahav? Wasn't there Zahav? Was he good? Not. La kashya. Kan kodem shenasa Shlomot bat Paro. Kan lahar shenasa Shlomot bat Paro. Amar Rabbi Yitzhak b'shasha shenasa Shlomot bat Paro. Yadel Geyel v'natz kaneh bayam v'lash Sutton v'alav nivrei krak kadol sheberomi. This is the Gemara I told you before. Now, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Kuf Aleph Amud Bet, says, Amar Rabbi Yohanan, mipnei ma zacha Yeravam lemalchut, mipnei shehochiach et Shelomo. Yeravam had things, he got it right. There was things to rebuke Shlomo about, and he rebuked him. Mipnei ma ne'enash, mipnei shehocho barabim. Did it in the wrong way. Maybe what it was mochicho barabim means, maybe it means that he had ulterior motives. Right? In other words, maybe hochicho means he had the right claim. Hochicho barabim, not the right motive. He wanted the downfall of Shlomo. But his ta'anot may have been correct. Okay? And what was his ta'ana? The Gemara continues. Zeh devar asher heshim yad b'melech Shelomo. Bana et hamilo, sagar et haperetz. David Aviv. אמר לו, דוד אביך, פרץ פרצות בחומה כדי שיעלו ישראל לרגל. They opened the walls, so Am Yisrael can come על יד הרגל. ואתה גדרת אותם, and you closed them up. You know why? כדי לעשות אנגריה לבת פרעה. That's why you closed up the things. Yeravam ben Nevat was appalled. This is all about Bat Paro. The Gemara is focused on Bat Paro. Pshat's hinting at Bat Paro. Right? Kedei lasot angaria lebat Paro. And where was he? Where was that Angaria? If we go back, where he work? He knew Milo firsthand. The roads were closed, blocked the city because of Bat Paro. Ken. Now, Rabbi Yosef Kara. Vayarem yad b'melech u'chiko barabim. What do you mean vayarem? He rebuked him publicly. V'zeh davar shilcha alav. Shlomo bana et hamilo sagat tepezet David Aviv. Aviv hini'ah makom hamilo patuach l'chol Yisrael. Sheyikansuu sham lidrosh et Elohim b'tzion lifnei ha'adon. Lifnei ha'aron. He opened it. V'zeh sagaro she'aya nizkar sham im bat paro. He closed it up so he could seclude himself with bat paro. Amru Rabotenu, and then he brings some of those midrashim and the gemarot that I mentioned. Banat hamilo, and what did he do there? And Rabbi Yosef Kara connects all the gemarot and all the midrashim. Ve'ini ha'maftechot shel bet hamikdash tatano v'yashen ad 4 sha'ot. V'haya nizgar sham im bat paro v'ayurem lehakitzo. Everyone was afraid to wake him up. Nimsat tamid shaya karev b'shah rishona haya karev otam ב4 sha'ot. ועל אותו היום אומר כי על אפיו וחמתי הייתה לי ארץ זאת. מה עשה ירבעם? כינס 1,000 משבטו ובא להר הבית אצל חכמי ישראל. He got 1,000 people and he came. אמר להם, דוד הניח לו ציון פתוחה. לכל ישראל, וזה שלמה בנאו ונזכר שם עם בת פרעה. This מילו is connected to בת פרעה. ובזה הדבר הרים יד במלך. Okay. So, this focus on Bat Paro, this focus on the change in Yisrael and the essence of Misrayim, and of course, as we see Shelomo going back to Misrayim, Shelomo turning to Misrayim in violation of the Psukim. Went to Mitzrayim. He married into Mitzrayim. He benefited, so to speak, quote unquote, from Mitzrayim. But again, Mitzrayim turns against him in the worst way, in the form of Hadad, in the form of Yeravam, in the form of Paro Shishak. It doesn't work, and it becomes Bat Paro amongst all the women. Hazal take Bat Paro. They don't take anybody else. They talk about Bat Paro as the one that's to blame for all this mess. To blame for Yeravam, who grows up in Misrayim. By the way, how ironic, just as a side point. What is Yeravam's complaint here? This is the irony of ironies. I don't know if you caught it. That how dare Shlomo block the way to the Beit HaMikdash? You have to... This is almost, as Hazal were writing it, you have to hear them chuckling, right? In other words, I'm screaming, how'd you dare block the ways to the Beit HaMikdash? Oh, we know what's going to happen with that one, right? In other words, you got to hear the humor, the irony, as Hazal are putting these words in the mouth of Yeravam ben Nebat. That's a side point. No matter, we get back to our point. He goes back to Misrayim. This is a sin that we know about. We hear other kings making treaties with Mitzrayim. Yoyakim, later, Yoyachim, brings Galut. Yoyachim. Sidkiyahu relies on Mitzrayim, brings Galut. The Navi calls Mitzrayim Kaner Atzutz, something that you can't rely on Mitzrayim. Right? It's a Kaner Atzutz. It's not going to help you. It's going to turn against you. Well, that's certainly what happened to Shlomo HaMelech. Shlomo HaMelech thought. And he thought, and I think, let's go back to the Gemara. Go back to the Gemara where Shlomo said, Ani arbe velo asu. Yeah, I'll do it. I will succeed. I will succeed velo asu. Why did Shlomo say that? We have to now have one last point. If we retrace our steps, Shlomo HaMelech built a strong state. But the economy changed. The middle class emerges. Wealth and security emerge. And Shelomo brings succeed. Shelomo brings wealth. That's the first problem. Then, of course, the wealth leads to more desire for security. Women who he loves, who he wants for treaties, specifically we're talking about Pharoh and Misrayim, and he has a cultural exchange. Right? That's what happens. And then, of course, the cultural exchange and the security all takes its toll, and he winds up building and creating idolatry in Yerushalayim. But let's go back to the first step. How come the security and the materialism got to Shlomo? Because he said, Ani arbe velo asur. Yeah, I could have both worlds. The world of the Bet HaMikdash doesn't contradict the world of the Zahav. I can do it both. I can be a religious person and have wealth. I can be ani asur, ani arbe, velo asur. It won't impact me. I can marry bat paro. I can, you know what I could do? I can not only follow a materialism pursuit, I can be zochet shtei shohanot. I can have wealth, and I'll stay firm in my beliefs. I can marry bat paro. You know what I could do? I could be part of the world. I could emerge. I can appreciate what the world has to offer. No, not just in wisdoms. Wisdom we know we can. Right? That we know. Shlomo got the wisdom. And he had that wisdom already from the beginning. The source was from Borei Olam. That's where he got his wisdom from. So what was he seeking out in the world? To be part of that world. He can have interactive relationships with the Miluchot. I can be part of that world. I can have the women. I can have that security that it benefits. I can have a little of the good part of Mitzrayim. Why can't I take the good and sift out the bad? Why can't I have what Mitzrayim has to offer in terms of security? In terms of material stability? Why can't I have that part? And still keep the Torah? Why can't I have a cultural exchange? Why can't I show them, in the words of Rabbi Yosef, what Torah is all about? Maybe they will be impacted. Ani arbe velo asur. I will interact with the world. I will have wealth and gold. I will have security that they have to offer. And guess what I can do? We can have a cultural interchange, and I can show them what Judaism has to offer. And I will not fall. I will not stumble. I will be modern. And what happens? Bat Pharoh turns Yerushalayim into a city of an idolatrous city. Get Shlomo to drink wine, to ignore the Beit HaMikdash, to forget about the goals, and start building homes for her. And of course, as we know, that becomes the center of the revolution. That's what unravels. The Mitzrayim in him undoes him. The Mitzrayim from without, the Mitzrayim from within. The Mitzrayim from within, meaning that aspect, ani arbe velo asur, vayasa. The two worlds can't mix. The Gemara says you can't test yourself. You cannot put yourself in a nisayon. It won't, that's what the Gemara is learning from here. It won't work. You test yourself, you're going to fail. And then, he says. The Mitzrayim from without. The violation of Devarim. They go back to Mitzrayim for that treaty. That relying on Mitzrayim is mutually exclusive from relying on Borei Olam. Lot chose Mitzrayim, he winded up in Sedom, in Kikara Yarden. Look at this Mitzrayim. He chose that. And laid the way later for Yakim and Tzidkiyahu. All to what? His children to make the mistake that the Nevi'im scream. You can't rely on Mitzrayim. It's antithetical to relying on Borei Olam. Agav, who didn't rely on Mitzrayim? Who relies on Borei Olam when he has an enemy around his borders? His Kiyah. Yeshaya says God will take care of it. And he does. So Malach comes and destroys. Miraculously. The mistake he does make, relying on Bavel, and of course we know Yeshaya screams. In essence of the reliance on HaKadosh Baruch Hu becomes the ultimate point. Shlomo's mistakes, the test. Thinking he can test himself with the surrounding cultures, being part of them, and he could survive it. That doesn't happen, right? There's a bit of Musara scale for us which is simply obvious, right? I don't think we need to even repeat that. I think the Musara scale, as I mentioned, the Mitzrayim. If I had to find the stable Mitzrayim, which praise materialism, consumerism, I think the mashal or the nimshal is obvious. Again, in today's day, the country that does that, and we need to remember that it is, of course, Shelomo thought that could work, but it didn't work. So.